Hello, my noble band of outlaws. Well, as you can tell, I'm going to be doing a quick video on the history of the katana. Now, I'm not going to go into super. This is like a brief history, but I felt like if you saw the last cutting video, I felt like you should know a little more about the history of how the katana was tested. So this is going to be a testing history video. Well, the katana was formed, and before I get into how they were tested, I need to explain the history of the katana. Historians have all agreed on this. The origins of Japan's culture and history originated from China. Most of Asian culture all have originated from China at some point, but with this in mind, the katana evolved from a Chinese sword called the jian. And the jin, or jian, uh, is a straight double-edged sword. I have a wooden training sword over here that if I can just get the damn thing over. The Now a jian is actually very much thinner than this, but what the jian is in essentially a double-edged straight sword that the katana was later evolved from. When the when the immigrants from China founded Japan, they based their language and their written language off Mandarin Chinese, which later evolved into the Japanese dialect. So, just as their language and culture evolved separately from China, so did their swords. And Japanese swords, in particular, traditionally had a very hard edge and a very soft spine. They were differentially tempered, and sorry, what that means is that the spine of the blade was coated in clay and heated, and when the sword was dunked in water or tempered, just a minute, that's better. So when the sword was tempered, the when the sword was glue red hot and it was dunked into the water, the spine would cool off much quicker than the edge. So what that means is the sword would go in straight, uh, then bow forward, and then curve back. And this happens very quickly, within 10 seconds of entering the water. And when that was done, what you had was a very soft spine and a very hard edge. The Japanese emphasized this even more by making a jacket style of sword forging, where if you look in the center of a blade, it'd be easy if I... This is something I tried to rig up for a back scabbard. And this is one of my training guards. Now pretend this was a chunk of high carbon steel, and this was low carbon steel. What the Japanese did when the Japanese swordsmith got the steel from the Tatar, the smelters, the ones who were making the steel, they would heat the steel up, flatten it, and then break it. What this would do is that if the steel broke cleanly in half, then it was high carbon steel. If the steel bent or broke in a jagged way, it was low carbon steel. It was lower carbon steel. And with that in mind, they would first forge the high carbon steel jacket, then they would forge a low carbon steel insert. Well, they would heat the jacket up, then they would put the low carbon steel in, let that radiate the heat till they're both somewhat the same temperature, heat both of them back up, forge weld them together, which means hammering the steel while it's hot, and locking that low carbon spine into the back of the blade with a high carbon edge. And the reason they did that was Japanese tamahagane, which is the traditional steel used, traditionally wasn't really pure steel. It had a lot of impurities, sulfur, slag. Not like a European crucible steel. That had a lot less impurities in it. It was almost pure steel in a way. And that's because the Europeans, they figured out how to completely melt the steel. What happens in Japan is you have iron sand from a river, sand with a lot of black sand, sand with a lot of iron in it. And with that in mind, the Tatara, they would shovel this iron sand out of the water, let it cool, let it dry, and in a huge clay furnace like an oven, they would light a charcoal bed and they would pour the steel in and they would pour charcoal on top of that. Now, what that did was that as the steel as the iron went through the charcoal down into the bottom, it picked up little bits of carbon along the way. And when it settled in the bottom of the Tatara, it would later, after about 3 days of constant smelting and constantly feeding, keeping the fire hot, would come out in a huge, almost molten in appearance block of steel. And the Tatara, his job, the head smelter, his job was to break the steel up. It's like, okay, this is very high carbon, this is very high quality, and determine which was the best qualities. So it's like, you have one lump here and one lump here, and it's like, this is very low quality, only good for kitchen knives. And over here, you had the Tatar, and it's like, oh, this is extremely high quality. This is good for a sword. I will send this to the swordsmith, and I will send this to a knifesmith. So, they would choose which are the best chunks of steel to go into whatever thing you were making. Gardening tools, kitchen knives, or swords and weapons. So once the blacksmith got his hands on the Tatar, he would again heat it up, smash it. Then after that, he would stack up the steel tiles so they would have very little gaps in between them. Then he would take wet paper, cover the thing in wet paper. Then he would cover it in clay, and then he would take burnt straw ash, put that on top of it all, heat it up, forge weld it, cut and hot fold a few times to consolidate the metal, make it all one solid piece. And the hot cutting and folding of metal actually removes impurities. That's not really needed nowadays with today's modern steels having like 0.1% impurities in them. But back then, you couldn't just take a block of steel and forge it out. Well, you could, but it would be very shitty, very low quality steel. It would probably break the minute you tried to cut it. Tried to cut something with it. But in any case, it's like so once the sword was completely forged and the rough ground and rough polish was put onto the blade, this would actually be considered a near rough polish, the satin finish on my sword. But in any case, it's like once that was finished, then the swordsmith would hand it over to the polisher, a person whose only specific duty and job was to polish the sword and sharpen it. He would start out with a rough grit, getting a foundation polish, move on to finer and finer grits of natural Japanese whetstones, which are increasingly rare actually nowadays, as I am to understand it. I do not personally know much about Japanese whetstones, but as I am to understand it, they are very rare. And the polisher, once he was done with the polishing and everything, the smith would come to see the final work. Now, a traditional full Japanese polish from beginning to end, as I understand it, takes somewhere in between a month and 6 months to do. I personally do not know the time frame of a traditional Japanese polish. I'm saying that because I actually do not. So if you do, leave comments below and hit the like button. This is the first time I've ever said hit that like button, and whatever. It's like, you like it, you like it. You don't, you don't. Take my advice with a grain of salt. Now, in any case, after the swordsmith had finished the polishing, it's like he would contact the... the polisher would finish the polishing. He'd contact the swordsmith, and it's like, oh, very nice. I crafted this sword, but you brought out the beauty in it. You have made my blade a diamond in the rough. A little Aladdin fun there. But, in any case, it's like, once the sword was completely polished and everything, and was completely forged, sharpened to the maximum that the polisher was able to sharpen it. And in actuality, if you have a traditionally made Japanese sword with the high carbon steel jacket and the low carbon steel insert, you gotta really be careful how much you actually cut with that thing, because you're forgetting that, again, it's not a solid chunk of high carbon steel. Eventually, and it's called wearing down the life of the sword. Japanese katanas were beautiful, they were strong, tough, and sharp, but they were also kind of fragile in a way, because rather than breaking like a mono-hardened steel blade, like European swords, they were through hardened, which means the center was as hard as the edge. So a mono-hardened steel sword has a tendency to break, but a differentially heat-treated sword, a differentially hardened sword, has a tendency to take a bend. So katanas were very much easily bendable, and slight bends could be corrected with just wiggling the blade around. Even if you had a bend like the swords here and then it bends like that, you could probably correct it by putting it into a vise. They had vice-like equipment back then, but in any case, not as strong as today's vices, but in any case, katanas were made to take a bend instead of breaking. And with that in mind, once the sword was completely polished and everything was done, you had the fittings on it, you had the guard, the tsuba, the suka, the kashira, the fushira, the ito wrap, everything, the samigawa raiskin, everything was wrapped up onto the sword. What do you do to test it? Now, I know I've been talking 13 minutes. I'm looking at my clock now, and I've been talking and kind of rambling a little quickly. So if you need to rewind this video, go ahead. I know I talk fast. But if you are... once you get the sword, like the swordsman is finished with the blade, how do they test the swords? Here's where it gets a little gruesome. Early Japanese, and testing swords in early Japanese history, as far as I'm aware, Sengoku was very much prominent in the Sengoku era, which was an era of warring states in Japan where everybody and his brother was off at war and criminals ran rampant, and it was a time of unpeace. It's like, I don't really know when the Sengoku era started. I think it was like I think it was like the medieval era, somewhere around 1300 to around 1500. Somewhere in that time frame. If I'm wrong, again, leave the comments down below. I just know that the Sengoku era was the warring states of Japan that I believed either started or ended around between 1300 and 1500. So, with that in mind, the Sengoku era, Japanese swords, they started to get bigger. Alright? Sword like this was actually more common length. This is actually a more Edo period, like Tokugawa era, sword. So after the Sengoku era, when sword law started to come into place, where only nobles and samurai could wear swords of certain length, that was actually a thing. Unlike in Europe, which in a lot of countries like medieval Germany, you were actually legally required by law in medieval Germany, and I'm not shitting you, to own weapons and armor. If you did it, you could be fined or jailed. And yeah, some cities like London, it's like you cannot wear a sword you cannot wear a sword of this length while in the city. You can have it outside the city, you can have it while you enter the city or while you leave the city, but you cannot wear this sword while you are in the city. You must turn it into wherever your residence is. You could own a two-handed sword. Shadowversity does a very good job of explaining this. You could own a two-handed sword in some medieval towns. You weren't by law restricted from owning a two-handed longsword. It's just in some areas, like in major cities and stuff, where policing was easily enforced. It's like you cannot wear a two-handed sword while you walk the streets in daylight. Or you cannot wear a two-handed sword while you are at night because it is a safety concern. And you would look suspicious. Or something along those lines. But in any case, with that in mind, back to the Japanese thing, it was actually and this was by law, a commoner could not own a katana. And katana, in actual translation, just means sword. And what that means is that a civilian, now, you could not own a katana. You could not own an actual sword. You could not own a sword that was over 3 shaku in length. And what a shaku is, it's basically like a foot. It's basically like the Japanese foot. Like, our measurement in America is, use my yardstick. A yardstick is 3 feet long. This is actually a 3 shaku sword. Very similar to this blade, which is 42 to 41 inches. But in any case, it's like, this would be a 3 shaku sword, because it would be perfectly 3 feet long. Now, common people could not wear that, because as Japanese culture improved, should it say, their laws changed. It's like, only nobility, landowners, shoguns, daimyos, samurai warriors of respected families. Like, if you were in the military and you were a samurai in the service of your lord, you could wear a sword that was 3 shaku over. That was 3 shaku in length. And, and there was even laws on what kind of furnishings, just a second. There's even laws on what kind of furnishings you could have on your sword. It's like, no, you cannot have a square guard. You must have a round guard. Or, you cannot have a blue wrapping. You must have a black wrapping. Or, you cannot have iron fittings. You must have copper fittings. Or something like that. Because different samurai had to have different symbols carved into their armor, engraved on their clothes, or even on their swords to symbolize which clan they were from. It's like, one is like, I'm just going to throw this out here. It's like, if you were from the Two-Finger clan and this other guy was from the One-Finger clan, it's like, and he goes into and the guy from the Two-Finger clan goes into the One-Finger clan territory, it's like, you there, you have broken our laws. You cannot you cannot have a 2-finger size guard. And it's like, I am from Two-Fingered land, or something like that. I'm not exactly sure on Japanese laws. If you know about ancient Japanese laws, feel free to leave comments below. I don't really read the comments all that much, so I probably won't see them. But I will look over them from time to time. And if I find a comment that is useful, I will try to make a video about it. But in any case, it's like I've gotten off on these side tangents. Now, what? It's like, but in any case, it's like back to the Sengoku era. The swords in the Sengoku era were a lot bigger than the swords in the Tokugawa and Edo eras. The Sengoku era, you had swords that were anywhere from this long to big honking motherfucking swords like this. And I can't get the... I'm trying to get the whole damn thing in this. You had huge ass Nodachi swords like this. Like, you had swords from anywhere from 3 feet long to 6 feet long. But in any case, we're going to stick with the standard katana length. Now, how were these swords tested in the Sengoku era versus the Tokugawa and other eras? Now, the Japanese sword, is a badass cutter. You've seen me cut with this thing. But in any case, the sword, it's like, how were they tested? Well, I am knowledgeable about this. Back in the Sengoku era, swords had basically one purpose: to kill your opponent. So, logically speaking, how would you test your sword? It's like, you can't really take an untested, unproven sword into battle. However, if you were to test your sword before... I think this thing is slipping. Before you go into battle, well, that's a whole other thing entirely. And how the swords were tested were kind of brutal, and I've been trying to dance around this, answering this question for a little bit, but I'm going to go ahead and answer it. Japanese swords in the Sengoku era, the katana, the tachi, the nodachi, the okatana, basically any form of sword, were tested on actual living people. Convicts, criminals, thieves, murderers, stuff like that. You could actually, in Japanese history, if a samurai thought you were insulting him, or even if you were to touch a samurai's sword without him specifically telling you to, okay, you servant boy, go fetch my sword. It's like, if he told you to fetch the sword, that was one thing. You were allowed to touch the sword then. But if you were to just go and get his sword without him telling you, the samurai could actually have some of his lower servants. It's like, you have touched my sword, so now you must have your hand chopped off. They actually did that. Samurai in Sengoku era, I believe, they were not nice people sometimes, and there are always assholes even in a warrior country who are complete dickheads and will cut off a little servant boy's arm. But in any case, yeah, you could actually have your arms cut off for touching a samurai sword. And thieving, you could actually lose fingers, hands. The Japanese correctional system was brutal. It was not something that a person would enjoy being part of. And I keep thinking this camera is... Alright, sorry I'm taking about 30 minutes to readjust this thing. But in any case, the swords were tested on living people and sometimes even dead people. So if you were arrested in Sengoku era Japan and you were thrown into the local lord's dungeon and you died in captivity, your body wasn't just straight out buried. Your death would be reported to the lord, and the lord, if the lord had a new sword being forged, he said, put the body in a place where it won't rot away too quickly. We'll use it to test my new sword. Or set the body up and I'll test my new sword on it. And that's what they did. There's even a complete sword style based off of this. That's where the modern tamashigiri art comes from. The art of tamashigiri, which is the art of cutting with the sword. That's where tamashigiri gets its roots. You know those guys who cut rice straw mats called tatami mats? The tatami mats were created because of this. And I'll get into that in a minute. But basically what the sword would do is you would call in an executioner, basically. A guy who was trained in how to perform very precise, very clean cuts with a sword. And the guy would come in, 2 or 3 other guys would hold down the convict, while there's even a manga based off of this. It's called Samurai Executioner, based off of this art form, if you could call it an art form. But in any case, it's the sword, the executioner. The lord or the samurai who was getting the sword forged would hand the executioner the sword, and the executioner would take the fittings off the sword and put it in a special grip that either came with the sword for testing, or in some cases I think they could even have a universal. I think there was even like a universal grip where like it was a wooden grip, but it was shaped to fit the any size sword tang. Not all swordsmiths forge their blades equally. Some forge them a little thicker, some forge them a little thinner. But in any case, it's like I think that they came with a special grip for testing. There's like a plain wrapped grip, kind of like mine, where it's just very plain. Now, this is actually covering my poor attempt at making a battle wrap. Well, not poor attempt. I like how the sword feels. But in any case, it's like it would come like kind of like mine, where it's just a plain cloth wrapping over a wooden grip. And the samurai would, depending on the crime, you could either just lose your hand, your entire arm, or would have your head cut off. The executioner, who was fully trained in this art form, would take the sword, hold it over his head, and basically cut off your head or cut off your arm. And after he had done the deed, he would look over the blade, see if there was any scratches or blemishes that needed to be corrected. After wiping down the blade, he would look at it. It's like, okay, this sword, the edge isn't blunted. There's no cracks in it. It's not bent at all. My lord, this is a good sword. And that was not the only way they would test the swords back then. Like I said, they would even test the swords on corpses, and what they would do is they would put 4 stakes into the ground, where you had 2 stakes here, 2 stakes there, and then they would put the body in between them. Then they would put a dead body in between them, and the executioner at this point is still testing the sword. He would try to cut through the bodies of the corpses, and it's like, oh, this sword, it can cut through 1 corpse. It can cut through an entire body. So this is a 1-body sword. That's how the swords were graded. 1 body, 2 body, 3 body. And they would continue. It's like, okay, do we have any more corpses? It's like, we got a shit ton, bro. It's like, it's wars going on. We're just taking the enemy's corpses off the battlefields at this point. And scooping them up by the truckload. Okay, put 2 more in between the spikes. So they would put 2 corpses in it, and again, coming down, cut the bodies, and it's like, okay, this sword can cut through 2 bodies without issue. So it's a 2-body sword, and they would keep doing that. That's how early Bushido and ways of testing the sword came about. Were cutting bodies and cutting off the limbs of humans. Well, we today would find that barbaric and cruel, but back then it was actually pretty damn smart. And even today, sorry, testing the swords against against actual flesh and bone, if that's what you are designing the sword to do, you're going to want to test it against the things that the sword is going to encounter on the battlefield, which is mainly guys in armor, of course, but also flesh and bone. You want to be able to know that, okay, this sword that I have forged, I know that it will cut a man from head to shoulder, from groin to head in one cut, because I tested it on a corpse. But in any case, with that in mind, they would take the corpses, they would test the swords, but as the Sengoku era kind of faded away and they leaned more towards peace and the Tokugawa, basically after the Battle of Sekigahara is when the Tokugawa era started and basically ended the Sengoku era. The Battle of Sekigahara was everybody, all these armies fighting, and when the Tokugawa came into power, they kind of started this reformation of the rules of etiquette for the warrior, if you want to put it that way. It's like, alright, so to keep peace, we're only going to allow certain groups to carry swords. And by the way, the Iga and Koga ninjas, they aren't just anime ninjas. They were actual real ninjas created by Hattori Hanzo, a ninja bodyguard for the first shogun. But in any case, it's like, so once, I just thought I should add that little bit in there, because I'm going to be talking about Tokugawas, and the Koga ninja were people who were allowed to carry swords. But in any case, also, you had samurai, obviously. They were allowed to carry swords. You had daimyos, which are like feudal lords or war. You had feudal lords, which were called daimyos. They were allowed to carry swords because they were noblemen. You had the shogun and the shogunate, who were definitely allowed to carry full-size swords. But then you had the common people, which were only allowed to carry a kodachi, which were like a wakazaki-sized blade on a full-size katana grip, or wakazaki in general. They weren't allowed to carry full-size swords. You could carry a blade that was over 2 shaku in length, just as long as it wasn't 3 shaku or 3 feet. So a blade that's like 34 inches might be pushing it a little, but again, it's under 3 feet or 3 shaku, so you could carry it. I don't know where the line would be at a sword that is exactly 3 shaku long. I think, or just a little shy of 3 shaku. I think that would be considered a full-size sword, or just a little shy. I don't really know. It's a gray area there. But in any case, when the Tokugawa came into power, they started reforming everything, and that also included the way they tested their swords. The Tokugawa shogun is like, we need to put these guys in like prisons and stuff that will, like, it's a much more fitting punishment if they are tortured by life instead of death. Basically, ancient prison, medieval prisons, and even in prisons in the East, which by the time the medieval period rolled around was far more advanced than us. Thank you, not having to deal with church, with the bullshit of church influence. I think I'm going to cut my neck. Damn it. It's like, yay! Christian influence hadn't spread there yet. It's like, sorry for all you Christians out there. I'm an atheist. Deal with it. If it wasn't for you damn Christianity, if it wasn't for damn Christianity, we'd have flying cars by now. The Dark Ages would have never come because the church never would have been able to oppress science and imprint their authority. But I need to get back to the topic at hand. But in any case, in the East, they were far more advanced than us, and even their prisons sucked. Like, prison's not fun at all, but even back then, prison today is a lot easier than prison back then. But in any case, with that in mind, yeah, my hair. With that in mind, the Tokugawa was like, we need to imprison these people. We need to make them pay for their crimes, trying to make them repent and stuff like that. So they basically said, we also need to relight the law of Bushido. So what they did was they reformed the laws of Bushido, they reformed the laws of Japan, and they reformed how swords were tested. So back to what I said in the beginning. So swordsmith would forge the sword, grind it to shape, send it to the polisher. The polisher would then polish the sword, sharpen it. They would then meet. Oh, I forgot to mention this. Back in the Sengoku era, after the sword was tested, if you were the lord or the one or the one receiving the sword, you could be present at the testing site. But if you weren't, the sword would still get tested. It's just that you would also get like a little certificate saying what exactly this sword can do. It's like, I am Lord Hikikaka, or whatever. It's like, I am Lord Momoratsu, and I say to Kokomaru, it's like, I was present at this sword's testing. It is a fine blade, worthy of a warrior of your status. It cut through 5 corpses in one swing. Make me a proud... Like, carry this sword with honor, and here is a certificate with my seal and my divine word. Yeah, that's basically what it was. And with the swords being tested like they were later on, you still basically got that authenticity. It's just that the sword testing mediums were changed a bit. And this is where the Tokugawa era shines and modern Tamashigiri comes into play. As I said earlier, the rice straw mats. So during reforming their nation, the Tokugawa shogunate was like, okay, so we have to find a new way to test these swords, because they're still going to be used for battle. It's just more dueling centric wise. So what are we going to do? It's like they started looking through all these cutting mediums. And eventually, someone figured out, hey, if we make rice straw mats, roll them up tight, then soak them over the course of a night, they represent a human arm. That's what that's what the tatami mats represent. Human limbs. Cutting a wet tatami mat is basically the same thing as cutting the human flesh. And later on, it's like, oh, if we put a bamboo pole in the center of this, then wrap it up, it's like cutting through bone. And then if we put a little piece of leather on it, it's like cutting through skin. So this is very much similar as cutting through leather or cutting through an actual human arm. That's what Tamashigiri was invented for, testing the swords, and that's why rice straw mats, tatami mats, were invented. Well, they were already invented, it's just more for bedding. But in any case, it's like, that's why the sword was invented like it was. I mean, that's why the tatami mat was used to cut, is used in Tamashigiri, because when you soak a tatami mat overnight, not only are you adding weight to the damn thing, but cutting wet tatami is actually easier than cutting dry.